Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
Airplane pilots of Reddit, what was your biggest we're all F*** D up moment that you survived, and your passengers didn't notice?
Episode 1.
Told by retired U.S. Air Force Major Brian Schule, as a former State Route 71 pilot and a professional keynote speaker, the question I'm most often asked is how fast would that State Route 71 fly? I can be assured of hearing that question several times at any event I attend. It's an interesting question, given the aircraft's proclivity for speed, but there really isn't one number to give, as the jet would always give you a little more speed if you wanted it to. It was common to see 35 miles a minute. Because we flew a programmed Mach number on most missions, and never wanted to harm the plane in any way, we never let it run out to any limits of temperature or speed. Thus, each State Route 71 pilot had his own individual high speed that he saw at some point on some mission. I saw mine over Libya when Gaddafi fired 2 missiles my way, and max power was in order. Let's just say that the plane absolutely loved speed and effortlessly took us to Mach numbers we hadn't previously seen. So it was with great surprise, when at the end of one of my presentations, someone asked, "What was the slowest you ever flew the Blackbird?" This was my first. After giving it some thought, I was reminded of a story that I had never shared before and relayed the following. I was flying the State Route 71 out of RAF Mildenhall, England, with my backseater, Walt Watson. We were returning from a mission over Europe and the Iron Curtain when we received a radio transmission from home base. As we scooted across Denmark in 3 minutes, we learned that a small RAF base in the English countryside had requested in State Route 71 flypast. The Air Cadet commander there was a former Blackbird pilot and thought it would be a motivating moment for the young lads to see the mighty State Route 71 perform a low approach. No problem, we were happy to do it. After a quick aerial refueling over the North Sea, we proceeded to find the small airfield. Walter had a myriad of sophisticated navigation equipment in the back seat and began to vector me toward the field. Descending to subsonic speeds, we found ourselves over a densely wooded area in a slight haze. Like most former World War II British airfields, the one we were looking for had a small tower and little surrounding infrastructure. Walter told me we were close and that I should be able to see the field, but I saw nothing. Nothing but trees as far as I could see in the haze. We got a little lower, and I pulled the throttles back from 325 knots we were at. With the gear up, anything under 275 was just uncomfortable. Walt said we were practically over the field, yet there was nothing in my windscreen. I banked the jet and started a gentle circling maneuver in hopes of picking up anything that looked like a field. Meanwhile, below, the cadet commander had taken the cadets up on the catwalk of the tower in order to get a prime view of the flypast. It was a quiet, still day with no wind and partial gray overcast. Walter continued to give me indications that the field should be below us, but in the overcast haze, I couldn't see it. The longer we continued to peer out the window and circle, the slower we got. With our power back, the awaiting cadets heard nothing. I must have had good instructors in my flying career, as something told me I better cross-check the gauges. As I noticed the airspeed indicator slide below 160 knots, my heart stopped, and my adrenaline-filled left hand pushed 2 throttles full forward. At this point we weren't really flying but were falling in a slight bank. Just at the moment that both afterburners lit with a thunderous roar of flame, and what a joyous feeling that was, the aircraft fell into full view of the shocked observers on the tower. Shattering the still quiet of that morning, they now had 107 feet of fire-breathing titanium in their face as the plane leveled and accelerated, in full burner, on the tower side of the infield, closer than expected, maintaining what could only be described as some sort of ultimate knife-edge pass. Quickly reaching the field boundary, we proceeded back to Mildenhall without incident. We didn't say a word for those next 14 minutes. After landing, our commander greeted us, and we were both certain he was reaching for our wings. Instead, he heartily shook our hands and said the commander had told him it was the greatest State Route 71 flypast he had ever seen, especially how we had surprised them with such a precise maneuver that could only be described as breathtaking. He said that some of the cadets' hats were blown off and the sight of the plan form of the plane in full afterburner dropping right in front of them was unbelievable. Walt and I both understood the concept of breathtaking very well that morning, and sheepishly replied that they were just excited to see our low approach. As we retired to the equipment room to change from spacesuits to flight suits, we just sat there. We hadn't spoken a word since the pass. Finally, Walter looked at me and said, 156 knots. What did you see? Trying to find my voice, I stammered, 152. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Walt said, don't ever do that to me again. And I never did. A year later, Walter and I were having lunch in the Mildenhall Officers Club and overheard an officer talking to some cadets about an State Route 71 flypass that he had seen one day. Of course, by now the story included kids falling off the tower and screaming as the heat of the jet singed their eyebrows. Noticing our habu patches, as we stood there with lunch trays in our hands, he asked us to verify to the cadets that such a thing had occurred. Walt just shook his head and said, it was probably just a routine low approach. They're pretty impressive in that plane. Impressive indeed. Little did I realize after relaying this experience to my audience that day that it would become one of the most popular and most requested stories. It's ironic that people are interested in how slow the world's fastest jet can fly. Regardless of your speed, however, it's always a clever idea to keep that crosscheck up, and keep your mock up, too. A long time ago, back in 1989, I was a first officer on the 747-100. We pushed back from the terminal in Anchorage and taxied out for a departure to Narita, Tokyo. We were full of people and remarkably close to max takeoff weight. At the end of the runway, it was my takeoff. I stood on the brakes, stood the thrust levers up, and the engineer set full take-off power. Released the brakes, and off we trundled. And we rolled and rolled and rolled down the runway. It was not sparkling acceleration by any means. As the end of the runway loomed into sight and takeoff speed was still some distance away, with the lights going, red, white, red, the captain said, and I quote, best you rotate. We were a good 20 kts below ver. Not being total numpty, I slowly and smoothly rotated, and the beast flew away off the end of the runway like a lady. We slowly climbed away, cleaned up, turned, and headed out west. Not a word was said for a long while. Finally, through 20,000 feet the engineer launched himself at my performance figures. Nothing was wrong, and we were at full power anyway. It turned out that extra cargo had been loaded in error, and we were well overweight. Apart from me wetting the seat and a raised heart rate, the passengers were none the wiser. When I was a student pilot, I was 14 I think at the time. I had about 15-ish hours done and getting close to soloing for the first time, but still had a few hours and more landings to practice. I was doing some basics and getting ready to come back with my instructor to practice some touch and goes for a bit. Coming back through we had to pass through DTW's Bravo airspace, means need permission to go through it. A few minutes before I was about to call for permission, my instructor got really quiet. I looked over at him and he looked really bad. I thought he was going to vomit, so looking for a bag. But then I noticed he wasn't breathing. I figure out where I am at and call up DTW approach. Declare a medical emergency and that my instructor was not breathing. I also told them I am a student and had never landed on my own before, and never in a large airport. Detroit approach was amazing at helping me. They gave me an option for DTW or Willow, but Willow would have added a good 5 to 10 minutes since I was coming in from the SC, opted for DTW and they were great at giving me vectors while also getting the big jets out of the way. I remember hearing them tell several planes to go around and several more into a hold. Anyway, did my approach and made the most butter-smooth landing I have ever made in my life, even till this day. The ambulance was right there on the taxi waiting for me. Turns out my instructor, who was only 25, had a heart attack. He ended up being okay. Overall, from the first call to him in the ambulance was less than 10 minutes thanks to ATC and DTW Tower. I'm a CFI at this point and I'm flying with a student. We saw a spider in the cockpit. I'm okay with spiders, but I don't want it distracting the student, so I mash it. The student missed the spider but saw my movement and asked what it was. I responded it was a spider. I killed it as I'm glancing into the back seat area. I managed to casually add, why, are you scared of spiders, without the student noticing the break in the sentence. Turns out the student is scared of spiders. For the rest of that flight, I squished spiders behind my student's back as they came forward from the nest I had just spotted in the back of the plane. He never knew. I was in the process of getting my PPL, private pilot license, and I was flying circuits solo. Before I took off, the CFO of the flight school asked me if I was sure it was a good idea to fly. It's pretty windy. I was flying a Cessna 152 on a day with wind pushing 15 kts and turbulence around 20. I honestly don't know what I or anyone at the flight school was thinking of letting me, 16 years old, take off. Anyways, a few bumpy circuits go by with no problem. I actually got some great practice landing in turbulence. So, the last circuit of the day, I'm on final with full flaps doing the absolute minimum speed for approach in a 152, not taking into consideration that the air is super turbulent. For those who don't know, when it's bumpy you should be going a little faster on approach than usual. Anyways, I'm quite close to the ground, maybe 300 to 400 feet, and I can hear the wind blowing over the sound of the engine. Suddenly, no wind. I had just lost 15-20 kts of almost direct headwind on final approach with absolutely no airspeed to spare. I remember my shirt sleeves looked like they were inflating, and the plane stall warning started screaming at me. The controls became useless, like a limp computer joystick. Thankfully, I had my hand on the throttle like my instructor taught me, and for whatever instinctual reason, good instructor probably, I gently pushed the throttle all the way and slightly lowered my nose. All of this took place in the span of about 5 seconds. I remember what I did, but not thinking about doing it. It was like when you drive somewhere, and you suddenly realize you've arrived without remembering driving. Scary. Anyways, I landed the plane simply fine and went home and took a nap. My parents said I was pale as a ghost when I got home. Flying is fun until it isn't. Edit, a lot of people are wondering why I gently pushed the throttle in. The reason is because the carburetor can't provide enough fuel to maintain the proper fuel/air mixture. When the pilot rapidly pushes the throttle in, the carb is supposed to provide a quick squirt of fuel to account for the rapid increase in air. If the pilot slams the throttle to the firewall, the huge amount of air coming into the carb is simply too much for it to maintain the proper air/fuel mixture, even with the extra squirt. In the best case, this can cause the engine to lag for a few seconds while the mixture catches up, and in the worst case, might actually cause the engine to stall completely. So, imagine an inexperienced pilot who panics and really jams the throttle all the way. That may have a disastrous effect because not only are they at low altitude with little airspeed, but they just choke their engine and simply can't get more power. I'm a relatively new student pilot and I was just starting to practice pattern work by myself, but my instructor either wanted me to go up with him for a few laps before soloing or with another instructor if he had other students. So, my instructor has another student he's teaching. I end up going up with another instructor just to verify that little 10 hours I can still fly a plane before I practice for an hour or two. We take off, and as I'm on final for our last practice run, it's a little shaky as it is usually in the mid-afternoon in Florida, but I'm confident in my ability to land the plane. Well, to my surprise, when I'm about maybe 100 feet above the runway, the plane just drops in an instant like someone took their hand and just pushed down. Luckily, my instructor must have trained me well because like you, I had my hand on the throttle and just gently pushed the power to full, leveled the nose, and made a smooth go around. Made me feel good knowing that my brain knew what to do without having to think about it much. Also, the instructor I was with I always thought seemed to look a bit angry, but I was pleasantly surprised when he smiled and complimented me on my quick decision making. Getting a compliment for doing something specifically well, other than like good job today, boosted me as a new student. It wasn't necessarily a situation where I'm thinking, oh, we could have died, but knowing that I'm capable of recovering from a scenario as such and not ending up like the guy who slammed a plane onto the runway and broke the gear. I still hear about the landing gear incident guy, and it's been months. Was learning to fly when I worked for the Gov, so, on my first flight with me taking off, we've been climbing for about 5 minutes and we're going through some gentle turns when instructor says, "We're going to head back, I don't feel well." He takes over the stick and he looks ashen. He then starts to breathe erratically and says I need to help him control the plane. He radios tower and up till now I'm thinking it's a prank. Mayday. He talks me through the whole thing. I'm trying to talk to the tower, repeat info, read gauges, remember lessons, listen to him, and hope he doesn't pass out. I was scared myself. Takeoff is one thing, but landing? We land like a kangaroo with a rocket up its ass. I'm surprised the wheels didn't fold. Must have been 4 big bounces, but it's a big runway. Scrub speed, finally get the plane to stop and instructor passes out. He had a heart attack. He survived, but only for a few months before I heard he passed away in his sleep. But he got us down. I never continued the lessons. I was an aircraft mechanic for the Navy back in the day on A4 Skyhawks. The student pilot notices his canopy light is on, indicating his canopy isn't all the way closed and locked. He decided it might help if he cracked the canopy open just a little bit and closed it again. I remember seeing it land as a convertible. We sent a couple of guys out in a pickup truck where they found the missing canopy in a farmer's field. This entire story occurred in less than 10 seconds and should have ended with headlines on CNN. Military pilot and not commercial, but it still could have ended in a disaster. Flying a CH-47D Chinook helicopter in Iraq mid-July 2008 when the temperature was over 130 degrees. Packed full of 36 passengers at an altitude of only 100 feet and speed of 140 knots, lower and faster than you'd ever fly in the US. We hit a thermal pocket of warm air that pushed us up, so I nosed the cyclic, looks like a joystick, between your legs, forward to maintain altitude. I was a brand new pilot flying with a combat vet who wanted me to maintain altitude of 100 feet almost exactly, so no higher than 120 or lower than 80 feet. Nosing the aircraft down kept us from going higher, but we immediately hit a downdraft and the aircraft started to fall like a rock. I pulled back on the cyclic as hard as I could to get the nose up, but it hit my body armor and wouldn't go back any further. I watched the altimeter drop all the way to 19 feet and miraculously we started falling and began to climb at the last possible second. During the debrief, the other pilot, now one of my closest friends, who had well over 1,000 combat hours, told me he's never been so close to dying before. I wasn't shaken up until I heard that. Even typing this today gives me chills. Once, departing Burning Man in a private plane with a couple of passengers, my engine conked out. I didn't even follow the engine out checklist. I glanced at the fuel pressure gauge, didn't like what I saw, hit the switch for the auxiliary fuel pump, and it came back to life. The whole incident was over so fast the passengers never even noticed. I wouldn't call it a we're all ducked moment, though. Worst case scenario, I would have had to set it back down on the playa, which is pretty flat terrain as far as the eye can see. Not a pilot but a passenger. Was on a 16-seater turboprop when suddenly there's a loud bang, all the lights went out, and we drop. We're all looking around like, what's going on, is this how we die? After a few minutes, the lights came back on and the pilot comes in, the PA, says sorry about that folks, but we were just struck by lightning. No need to worry, everything seems to be working. Except for the radar. It's fried. I may have worried a little. I'm a commercial helicopter pilot. Probably the closest moment to were ducked I ever had was a few years ago. To set it up, I was ferrying a helicopter by myself to another location about 200 miles away. The helicopter I was flying was set up for IFR, instrument flying, and I'm a fairly experienced IFR captain. The helicopter I was in does not like ice. That means that flying in the clouds when it's below freezing is basically impossible. This was in the high Arctic, in the early spring. So basically, always cold. The weather wasn't great, but I still wanted to give the trip a shot. If it were bad, I would just turn around and come home. About 50 miles out, the cloud ceiling was coming down, and visibility was dropping. I was over a small frozen lake, and I could see at the other end of the lake that the clouds were right on the ground. At this point I'm about 300 feet above ground. I make the call to turn around, and start a left-hand turn, but as I'm halfway through the turn I enter a cloud. Under normal circumstances, a VFR helicopter unintentionally entering cloud is often a death sentence, but I'm a trained IFR pilot in an IFR helicopter. I started a climb, as I know there is rising terrain on the side of the lake. I don't mind flying in clouds. What I do mind is the fact that my helicopter starts icing up instantly. I'm not talking about a bit of ice, I'm talking about a massive amount of ice, in a helicopter that doesn't like any ice. There is no way I can make it the 50 miles back to the airport to shoot an IFR approach, and I know the clouds are too thick to climb above them. I also can't descend because the ceiling is so low that I risk impacting the terrain if I don't pop out of the clouds soon enough. I'm running through the options in my head, but my heart rate is going up. This isn't something that normally happens. I'm not the type of pilot that gets into situations that scare me. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I head to a larger flat area, as indicated on my GPS and maps, set my radio altimeter, a device that tells you exactly how far above the ground you are, to beep at me when I reach 250 feet, and start descending. I figure if I don't break out by 300 feet, I'm in some serious trouble. As I'm approaching 300 feet, I break out of the clouds. Good visibility, and a clear path all the way back to the airport. I do a normal approach and landing and shutdown at our hangar. The blades are covered in ice. After I change my underwear, we pull the helicopter into the hangar to let the ice thaw. The next day, the weather was beautiful, and the trip went off without a hitch. After flying for 10 years and thousands of hours, it was the only time I was actually scared. I'm glad I didn't have any passengers on board at the time. There's never been a moment like this for me because you're always trying something else to save the plane. There's never been a real situation where I had to save a plane from imminent disaster. There are decisions I've had to make that if I chose wrong we can be in a bad spot, but never anything like we're all going to die. Once when landing a RJ on a short runway out in the northeast, I was carrying a little bit too much speed and caught a gust at the wrong moment in the landing flare. The plane lifted maybe 10 foot higher and I slowly lowered my nose. I realized at this moment that where the plane touched down will not give me a whole lot of opportunity to stop before the end of the runway. In fact, it's probably not going to stop until we get into the trees at the end. I pushed the power up and we did a go around maybe 20 to 30 feet off the ground. The controllers vectored us around and we landed safely on try. Number 2. In the simulator we do all the O stuff, and even when a training event goes sideways, we still try to fly the thing until it hits something solid. I can't imagine ever giving up on the plane in flight. There are thousands of decisions made every day on flights by pilots that prevent a tricky situation from becoming dangerous. Flying these days is overly cautious and conservative. Safety is always first and nothing is allowed to ever slide. Uncoordinated turn and all the fuel went to one side of the plane. Choked both engines, sputtered and cut out. 3,000 feet high, so brought back the coordination and pointed down a bit. Then started back up. Yikes. Edit, well, this got some attention. Some clarifying points. Number 1, not an airline pilot. I'm an aerial photo pilot. Had one passenger, the camera operator, and he didn't notice, but to be fair he was pretty into his podcast. Number 2, it was intentional to be uncoordinated. We use skidding turns to turn 180 degrees faster so we can get one line and collect more pictures. Number 3, it was a light twin, we were low-ish on fuel and that's what enabled the airplane to be starved of fuel. Under normal circumstances, this would not have happened. Okay. Clear skies. Adios. This was about 7 years ago now. I took my brother and 2 cousins up for a short sightseeing flight one morning in a Cessna 172. I knew there was some weather coming in, so I wanted to get it over with quickly. About 20 minutes in I noticed the clouds getting worse and then some lightning off in the distance, definitely time to head back. Heading back, I radioed my intentions, uncontrolled airport but with an FBO, and someone radioed back with the current winds. It didn't compute what they said, and in retrospect I should have asked for clarification. Get back to the airport and as I'm on final I realize just how bad the wind is. Having a tough time keeping on centerline and eventually go around on the first try. By now I'm starting to be nervous and planning on rerouting if the next attempt doesn't go well. I make sure to turn the intercom off so my cousins in the back can't hear how panicked I'm becoming, though I did keep my cool through the whole thing. On second attempt I've got the rudder pegged to the left and managed to get the wheels on the ground safely. I taxi to park, shut down, jump out, and start shaking with adrenaline and let out a huge sigh of relief. My cousins had no idea what had just happened, it was just an exciting flight to them. My brother kind of knew what was going on, and I let him in on what I was thinking later. Apparently, I had an audience of guys from FBO watching me as well, probably yelling at me to go somewhere else. I'm honestly surprised sometimes I managed that landing with no incidents, especially since that was basically my first crosswind landing. I'm an airline pilot now, but my first job was flying banners. I have another good banner 2 story, but I've told it before. I didn't have passengers, but I had viewers, and from their perspective, nobody noticed. One day as usual I was given the job of heading to a fairly distant location, unpacking, and setting up my banner, and picking it up and flying it. The setup went like it usually does, and I took off to pick the banner up. In banner towing, the way it works is you've got a grappling hook at the end of a cable that's attached to the tail of the aircraft. You take off without the banner attached, and come back around, swooping down steeply toward a loop of rope you have set up on the ground held up between 2 posts, running down to the banner. At the last second, you yank the plane back skyward, and the hook is supposed to swing between the posts and hook the rope. On my pickup, I felt the satisfying pull of the banner as I leveled off, but something was wrong. It was pulling hard to the left side. A quick look to my left showed that I had missed with the hook, and instead caught the banner rope loop with my left main wheel. Even worse, instead of sliding up the gear leg to the fuselage, the rope had caught down near the wheel. I had been provided with a steak knife for the purpose of cutting the rope, but there was no way I was going to be able to reach that rope. The plane was yawning hard, but it was under control, and I flew slow circles around the airport while I thought about my options. I could always try to land the plane with the banner attached, but from what I'd heard, that usually results in the plane tipping over onto its nose, ruining the engine and propeller at the very least, and probably causing a lot more damage, not to mention the risk to my own life. I couldn't cut the rope because I didn't have the reach. Then I remembered what I had: a small toolkit and a roll of duct tape in the pocket behind my seat. I thought about what I could use those to do, and it occurred to me that the empty second seat behind me also had a metal tube control stick. Well, it would be worth a shot. I controlled the plane with my knees while I reached behind my seat to get the toolkit. Only a single bolt and nut secure the control stick to the tube below, but I had to access it blind, reaching below and behind me while also controlling the plane. After a couple of guesses as to which size socket to put on the ratchet, I had a good grab, and managed to get the nut off and extract the screw. A brisk pull-up dislodged the control stick. It was working. The stick was a couple of feet long and I figured it would be enough to reach out the window and down to the rope. Still flying on my knees, I stuck the steak knife handle into the bottom end of the control stick, and wrapped a bunch of duct tape around the joint until I felt it would be secure. It was time to try it. I lined up for my pickup site and reached as far out the left window as I could. While fighting the slipstream, I could just contact the rope. When I reached my target, I started sawing wildly at the rope, but it sliced through with surprising ease. I felt the plane lurch as the banner dropped back down to earth. I landed the plane and took a few minutes to breathe, thinking about what had just happened, and then what to do next. It occurred to me that I could tie a knot in the rope and just pick it up again. And that's what I did. Suffice it to say I was a bit more careful this time, and everything went as planned. From the ground, the only thing anyone would have noticed is that a banner plane picked up a banner and just stayed in the area for a while, dropped the banner, then picked it up again and headed off. The only example I can think of is where several people ducked up and passengers didn't notice. A friend of mine took the wrong airplane. The aircraft was parked, fueled, and boarded correctly, but it was the wrong tail number. He actually did have an AMA moment taxiing out. So, he called dispatch and requested an amended release for the tail he was about to fly. But then he took off before receiving the amended release, so that got him a review board. He had screwed up a few other things recently too regarding international paperwork, so he was downgraded to the right seat for a time. Passengers didn't know. It could have been my story, but every time I sat down in the cockpit I checked the tail number versus the release. In one case where there was a mismatch, the passengers did notice because the aircraft were swapped at the gate, causing a delay. I wasn't the pilot, but I was a passenger on a glider. For those who don't know, gliders cannot get off the ground on their own. For this glider, we needed a tow plane, a 172. The 172 has 2 hooks that they clip into our nose. When we want to release, we go through a release procedure. The pilot in the 172 dips a wing to signal the release. He slows down, we dive. This creates slack. We nose up, then release the tow cable, the Cessna flies on its merry way and we glide. Well, during the release procedure, something went wrong, and the cable could not be released. The glider pulled on the tail of the Cessna and caused a ton of chaos, as flying a 172 with a glider that isn't synchronized with your motions is incredibly hard. Luckily, we both made it back in one piece. But that could have very well caused the 172 to stall and crash, and we would be dragged down with them, watching helplessly. During my first solo flight ever, I was really excited and wanted to video record the special occasion. So, there I was, taxiing down the taxi path with one hand holding my phone. One thing about old propeller planes is that they're just like old cars, and don't always drive straight. I suppose I was a little too concentrated on making sure my camera was properly angled and focused. Next thing I knew, my plane ended up rolling off the asphalt, into the grassy ditch. I panicked. How FT am I supposed to get this plane out of here? Over the radio, there was a silence, as the controller likely saw what happened from the tower. After a few seconds, probably still speechless at this point, she casually checked on me to make sure I was doing okay. To avoid my embarrassment, I tried to power up and drive out of the grass back to the asphalt. Much to my surprise, it worked. I did my short flying as planned and returned to the hangar where my instructor was waiting. I have no idea how many people saw what happened, but from the look on his face, I'm fairly sure he knew too. And yes, that video of me driving a plane into a ditch still exists somewhere. I suppose this is the airplane equivalent of don't text and drive. My friend has a private license, and we fly together often, just for his hours. I buy lunch, he gets hours, it's fun. I live in the PNW and wanted to fly over Crater Lake one winter. Ceiling 8,000 feet, Crater Lake, 6,000 feet. He doesn't have his instrument yet, so we can't break the ceiling. We fly over, have an easy time, take great pics, etc. We got back to the airport, went to the bar, and he proceeded to tell me that was the most frightening he'd ever been piloting. Why? The single-engine Cessna we were in could glide 2 to 3 miles in an emergency. Crater Lake is 8+ miles in diameter. In the middle, we'd be ducked. I asked him what he would do. He said, I'd nosedive into the water. You want to swim in that and drown, or die quick and mostly painless? FML. I was the passenger on the plane. It was my first time flying alone, so it was important for me. Chicago to Tampa. The way there is fine. The way back to Chicago. It was a boring, commercial flight. The plane wasn't completely full, but there were quite a few people still. We were approaching Midway Airport, but something happened. There was a big bang and a huge sudden drop. The plane then jerked up and away, and for some reason we had to go to O'Hare instead. So, we're over the lake and we're told to assume the crash position. I was 12. When the flight attendants were in their seats in the crash position, I knew it was bad. The whole time the plane is jerking and going up and down, weightless one moment and then a jerk and normal feeling. We were so close to the water. I'm just thinking that I want to see my family and everyone again. We're finally approaching O'Hare, and we see fire trucks and ambulances by the airport and watching that runway approaching so fast, and the captain came on and said to brace for an extremely hard impact. The wheels were stuck, I guess so somehow. Somehow we landed in a perfect glide without hitting anything. We did veer off across another runway and stopped in the grass. It was rough and bumpy, and the noise of metal against concrete was like nails on a chalkboard times a million. But the only real damage was whatever failed, and the belly of the plane was banged up, that's it. I was so far into fear that when I finally looked up I saw the bins had opened and everything was everywhere. It was just silence. Then everyone's just cheering and hugging each other. The pilot comes on and says, well, I think I will give this roller coaster ride a 2. Then in seriousness talks about the slides coming out and all that. We're all walking out, and everyone is just shaking the pilot's hand, and it's my turn, and I'm a hormonal emotional 12-year-old and just hugged and cried. I was so embarrassed after, but he was simply happy because I was a kid, and I was okay. Then I got to go down the slide. Not as fun as you think, lol. After everyone is checked out by paramedics, we get taken to a gate and we get in, and I'm looking around for my dad since he was the one who was supposed to pick me up. And I hear him yelling my name, and so I'm screaming, "Daddy! Daddy!" Sigh. The fiercest hug I ever got from him, and one of a handful of times I've seen him cry. He's doing that thing where parents just check you all over like arms, legs okay, no blood, you okay? I was the only kid on the plane, so people were cheering and clapping during all of this. My dad finds the pilot and shakes his hand thanking him. The pilot was just like I was doing my job. My dad was like, "No, you do your job every day. Today you had to go above and beyond what your job usually requires of you." We're leaving, and my dad told me when they had announced the emergency over the system at Midway Airport, he never felt his heart drop so fast. This was back when you could meet people at the gate so suddenly. He said there was a bunch of people running. He took some other people with him, but they had taken the bus to Midway. It's about a 45-minute drive from one airport to another. They were pulling in when the plane started to make its descent, so he pulled over and they watched it land. Obviously, they didn't know the condition of the inside of the plane, but they got hope then. Later, we get more details on what happened. A goose got sucked in the engine. Normally it wouldn't have done anything, but it was like a series of freak incidents after it happened. I don't remember the technical details, but I guess another engine failed and then the tail went awry. They were 100% thought we were going to crash into the lake. That's why he changed course. It was either a residential area and us or just us. They had grounded all planes meant to take off from O'Hare, so I'm only assuming all eyes were on us from the tower. Somehow he managed to keep us high enough to avoid crashing. I don't know all of what he had to do, just that he should not have been able to make it. Sorry for the long post. P.S. My dad found out what he and his co-pilot were making in a year and wrote a check for that amount. My parents and my sister and I took them to dinner and gave them their checks. The main pilot and I kept in touch. He's like a third uncle. TLDR, I was 12 years old and survived a crazy freak plane crash over Chicago. No one dies. All is well. The pilot is an honorary third uncle. Edit. A lot of you are asking if it was on the news. I asked my uncle, and he said it was definitely on the local news. He's not sure about national. He did say there should be a NTSB report, so he'll try and get that for you all. Edit 2, lots of questions. Let me see if I can cover them. Yes, my dad does make a lot of money. He worked hard and climbed an exceptionally long ladder. The finance world is brutal to those who start from the bottom. He didn't make it until a few years before this incident. He made sure to always pay it forward. The pilots made an abysmal amount for the insane number of hours they had to work. I'm not sure on the amounts, but I know co-pilot made like around $25K. Uncle made around $50K. 2, definitely not the one in 1988. It happened in... Hold on, math time. Summer of 1997. I think it was a Southwest plane, or was it Delta? Was the Southwest even around yet? Maybe it wasn't from Tampa but Orlando. But that wouldn't make sense, because my grandparents lived closer to Tampa International. We only went to Orlando if we did Disney World. So, I am positive it was Tampa. My uncle knows more than I do. I don't remember the details like that. He'll have the report or paper soon, I'm sure. I can ask him for more specifics. I've been looking for an explanation from a pilot to the experience I had on an Embraer 145J from Newark to Albany one afternoon. I've been on a lot of flights, especially that little hop, many times. I know what the normal sounds are, including when it sounds like the engine's cut out and it feels like some hit the brakes. This was different. We took off like normal, but about a minute into the climb, the plane went dead silent, and we went into an abrupt nosedive for 3 to 5 seconds, which felt like eternity. At least 7 people screamed. I clutched my armrest and made peace with that fact that this was finally happening. I always knew I would die in a plane crash. Miraculously, the engine suddenly kicked back in, and we went right back into a sharp climb. 5 seconds after, the exact same thing happened to us again. The plane's engines went silent, and we were pointing hard back at the earth. More people screamed this time, and it was louder than the first time. Again, the engines turned on and we got up to cruising altitude, but the whole flight was shaky. It felt slow. It really felt like we were about to drop out of the sky. There was a woman from Long Island in front of me nervously talking to everybody, saying things like, "My mother would say he's acting like a hawshaft." We landed in Albany with no explanation as to what happened. Most pilots I've ever asked to shake their head in confusion, unsure what could have happened. One explanation was that there's a mandatory noise abatement protocol over certain neighborhoods in Newark. Oftentimes they'll get clearance to not back the engines off. Possibly in this case, the pilot thought he would get the clearance, air traffic peeps said no, and made the pilot back off and drop back down to a certain altitude, and they did that in the worst way possible for non-pilot passengers. This sounds like bullshit to me, but it's all I have. This experience traumatized me a little bit, so a real explanation would be great. My friend's girlfriend is a flight attendant and they had one trip where they ran out of alcohol. They were worried people would get mad or freak out because some people heavily rely on alcohol to help with the nerves of flying, but none of the passengers noticed because after they served the last drink nobody ordered anything else. It's not a crazy life or death scenario, but I thought it was an amusing anecdote about the passengers not realizing something. Not a pilot but was an air traffic controller. I have a million ducked up pilot stories though. One somewhat amusing story, yet also sad, was a pilot who flew in on emergency fuel in his MiG. He flew around to air shows. He was erratic and didn't listen to instructions well, but landed safely. He left my airport a few days later. He went down in the mountains and was never found. The finding was, likely low fuel due to scraping his fuel tanks at an airshow prior to arriving at my airport. He never even had it looked at while he was at my airport. He was aware he had scraped his fuel tanks. He came into my airport emergency fuel, yet pressed on? This is seriously one of the million, pilot stories I have. They're just people. They're flawed like the rest of us. I know this doesn't fit this thread at all, but I've been wanting to share this for years. It's actually quite the opposite in a lot of ways, but I'm telling it. I was at work one day, and this guy, known for telling great tales, calls a girl at my work as he's leaving South by Southwest. He tells her his plane might be going down. It spreads like wildfire throughout the company, and I hear about it. So naturally think yeah relight and bring up his flight on FlightAware to see a really messed up flight pattern. Anyway, his story went like this. They're just taking off and the right engine disintegrates. The captain comes on and says what happened and that they need to dump fuel and try to land. The try part comes from the fact they're not sure if the engine took out the landing gear. At this point everyone is panicking and even the flight attendants are crying and freaking out. The captain comes back on and says to assume crash positions, which is basically putting your head down and kissing you goodbye. They land and all is good. What I saw on FlightAware was a plane take off and circle like 8 times then land. I couldn't imagine that and think about it every time I take off in a plane. The chaos and feelings my friend and everyone else must have felt must have been intense. It never made it on the news, it never was reported, which only makes you wonder how often stuff like that happens. I was a C-141 navigator for my first AF assignment. We were flying a group of families moving back to the US from Japan. As we were approaching Travis Air Force Base we had a massive multi-bird strike. It sounded like the world was ending inside the cockpit, it was so loud. Shattered glass that was coated in blood and feathers, bent, redone, you name it. Flight controls were fine, but we declared an IFE and the co-pilot could see well enough out his window to land, and I and the FE were over his shoulder to help spot however we could, and we landed without incident. The passengers deplaned and even complimented us on the great flight. I will never forget the right side of the passenger bus driving away and the look of horror on those people's faces when they saw what the front of that airplane looked like. In 1994, while lining up for final approach to George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston on a sunny and humid 100 degrees Fahrenheit day, our Boeing 747 hit a large downburst and suddenly dropped 1,000 feet in altitude without warning. All of the passengers were seat belted in and were completing their U.S. Customs declaration cards. The flight attendants were walking the aisles making sure that the passengers and aircraft were ready for landing. The sudden drop caused the flight attendants to hit the ceiling. Fortunately, none of them were injured, but the aircraft definitely experienced negative G-forces for a few seconds. My best friend's dad was a pilot for Western and Delta for a lot of years. He's always said that the most terrifying thing he experienced was flying into Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong. Due to the terrain and high rises at one end of the runway, you had a pretty sharp right turn on final approach, and it took you close enough to the high rises that you could see TVs in the apartments. Once in 2013 my plane failed to start the engine at the alternative airport, and I have to spend 2 more days in a poor hotel with all my 158 passengers waiting for repair parts. I thought they would kill me every time I meet any one of them those days. Passenger here. There was once when I was little, we landed, and the pilots told us to put down our window shades to keep the plane cool. They were pretty insistent. Being a kid, I kept it open a bit to peek out and saw after a little while that we were taxiing backwards. I don't know what happened, but I think they didn't want us to know they made a wrong turn or something. Oops. I'm an air traffic controller, for the record. Had a pilot go Nordo, that's when, for whatever reason, they aren't on my frequency anymore. They didn't get the right one, misheard, or their radios crapped out. It happens fairly often, and there are a number of things we can do to get you back in the right place. This particular guy, however, went Nordo at precisely the worst time. He was going eastbound, which means he was at an odd altitude. He lost his radio, and his flight plan then had him turn southbound. That means he was supposed to be at an even altitude, which he obviously wasn't. There were about a dozen different planes going northbound that were at his altitude, so he ended up running one heck of a gauntlet through all these people as I was descending and climbing them to get them out of his way. Then, apparently in an act of sheer ignorance on the pilot's part, he decided to choose an even altitude all by himself, knowing he should probably be at one. Remember all those planes I had to move out of his way? He managed to put himself right back into them. When you have closure rates of over 1,000 knots, that's not a lot of time to react to those things. At the end, I was clenched so tight that when I stood up, the seat came with me. Obligatory not an airline pilot, but I am a private pilot and know a handful of airline pilots. Most of the things that make you feel like you're going to crash in a large jet/turboprop are really not significant. Planes can handle way more turbulence than you fly through, that sound is probably normal, and the engine quitting doesn't mean you're going to fall out of the sky. Go-arounds, where the plane aborts its landing, happen a handful of times a day. At most airports it's nothing out of the ordinary. Flying on a U.S. airline is one of the safest things you can do. You're more likely to die driving to the airport or even falling out of bed than you are in a large commercial airliner crash. Also, tarmac isn't any part of an airport, but rather a material that was used to make airport surfaces decades ago. A runway is where you land/takeoff, taxiway is where planes are moving and speaking with air traffic control, ramp/apron is where planes are parked and pushed back. Flying around in a Skyhawk, C-172, in gusty winds a few weeks ago I was getting bumped all around. Turbulence sucks, but on most things you would be flying out of JFK, that turbulence is nothing unsafe. It may make you feel sick from the bumping, but the plane is going to be fine. It's also not possible to predict turbulence entirely. Most of what they know about the turbulence is from planes ahead of them on similar routes/altitudes. Treat the turbulence like a ride in an amusement park and maybe you won't be as anxious about it. My cousin was a pilot small craft like crop dusters and helicopters. He was probably a pretty competent pilot, spent a lot of time flying bad forest fires, running power lines, flying geologists on erupting volcanoes, removing shot-up soldiers from across enemy lines while being shot at, etc. One time he took me up in his crop duster. It was a little single-seater. I was sitting on the empty chemical tub behind his seat. We were flying over a small town, not sure how high, but not extremely high, perhaps a couple thousand feet. I was leaning way over trying to get a look out the window, when he started to look left and way right, like he was trying to see the tail end of the plane. He was methodically checking various controls, and also appeared to be methodically messing with the little mechanical trim controls. Finally, he looked back along the inside of the cabin, just under the window, and when he got to where I was leaning out the window, he asked me to move away from the window a bit. After we landed, he pointed out the little rudder, if I recall correctly, control wire that I'd been leaning on pretty hard. He said that he'd been fairly sure that there was a control failure of some kind, and that he thought we'd possibly be landing fairly hard in a not optimal place to land. Man was unshakable. February 2017, flying American Airlines from Miami to Bam. We boarded the plane and noticed it was extremely hot. The air wasn't working. The attendant said it was, but the air blowing out of the vents was hot AF. Anyway, we were about 45 minutes out in the flight. We're all burning up and sweating our asses off. The pilot comes over the speaker, says that we are headed back to Miami and not to worry, but we've lost cabin pressure. Like I said, we were 45 minutes out from Miami, but it only took us like 20 minutes tops to get back to Miami. I knew it was serious with the attendant buckling herself in as soon as the pilot made the announcement. It was solo hot and hard to breathe. What was even scarier is watching your plane pass the airport to fly over the ocean and dump fuel. I'm assuming that's just in case we land badly, less chance of exploding. When it came time to land, we were directed to a clear section of the airport. You could see emergency crews lining the tarmac like they were just waiting to recover bodies. It was the worst landing of my life. I swear to God, we came in so hot we were on two wheels for a few secs. A friend of mine on the trip with me had never flown before and was nearly in cardiac arrest. I was just dumbfounded when any of this was happening. Anyway, they let us off directly on the tarmac as quickly as possible. We had to wait 2 hours for a different plane. American Airlines offered us all free beer to make up for the scare though. Then we had to wait an additional hour because our flight attendant had gotten so freaked out she grabbed her wheeled bag and went home. Helicopter pilot here. I was flying a relatively short tour with 3 passengers in an R-44 over some vineyards near the airport I was flying out of. Passengers were all pretty cool and relaxed through the flight, so naturally I was as well. The person up front with me was extremely interested in what I was doing and how everything worked. He had a million questions, and I was happy to answer them all. Anyways, the tour is almost over and I'm on about half a mile final when the clutch light turns on. For those not familiar, the clutch light on Robinson helicopters is pretty normal and comes on whenever the clutch is adjusting. Especially in colder climates, it is completely normal to come on for a few seconds and go away, no big deal. However, if it stays on for more than 10 seconds, we're potentially in big trouble. So, the clutch light comes on while I'm mid-sentence and I subconsciously start counting. Somewhere around 7 I stop talking, flip the pilot ISO, practically in denial that this is about to happen. I get to 10, pull the clutch circuit breaker. At the same time, I felt just the slightest tail shudder, so I pushed for some extra airspeed and mentally prepared to do an auto, power off landing. Luckily, we made it to the ground fine and I never lost power. After I set it down, the person up front looked at me and said, "What was that all about?" So, I just said I thought you guys would enjoy a little excitement at the end. They thought it was awesome, so I sent them on their merry way none the wiser. After they walked away, I opened it up to see only one of the 4 clutch belts still in place. Scariest day that those folks will never know they had. About 15 years ago, I was a passenger on a flight that started having bad turbulence. The flight attendants were serving drinks, so they locked up their carts as the pilot told them to sit down. A minute into it, I realized we were also descending very rapidly. I caught a glimpse of the 2 flight attendants holding hands and I thought, wow, even they are scared, and it really unsettled me. A minute later and we were still bumping around and descending fast. Everyone starts gasping and a few people yell, "Drinks are flying everywhere." I don't know why I had just assumed that if we were all about to die that the pilot would make an announcement, and then I realized that they probably wouldn't say anything to keep everyone calm. I look at the flight attendants again and they are both sobbing, holding on to each other. I was fairly sure that if they knew we were about to die. Obviously, we all survived, and I have no clue what was going on or if we were ever in real danger, but now I search the flight attendants' faces whenever there's any tiny bit of turbulence. From a commercial pilot's perspective, I'm deeply sorry to say there aren't a whole lot of "we're all ducked" moments. It's a really safe industry. Minus the odd accident such as the tragic 737 MAX events recently, the vast majority of days are quite vanilla. We take off, fly a bit, drink some coffee, then land. Rinse and repeat. That's not to say things don't happen. Minor stuff happens regularly, small stuff. Not too long ago I was operating a really early morning sector, first of the day, ground crew asked to remove the ground power, gave them the thumbs up only to realize a fraction too late our APU wasn't on, plunging an aircraft and a few hundred people into complete darkness. That's awkward as hell, making a PA apologize for that mistake. Or, flying along, looking out the window, expert caution starts flashing at us, door 1L open. Check cabin pressure, it's all good, call cabin crew, door is still in place. As usual, the micro switch which indicated door position to the aircraft had failed. There is an insane amount of force holding the doors shut, it's impossible for them to open in the air, but some switches do fail. We follow procedures, safety is maintained. Or TCAS, Traffic Collision Avoidance System, the name explains its purpose, events, when aircraft get a bit too close to each other. Not common in my part of the world due to the superb air traffic controllers, but it does happen every now and then. Or unwell passengers, diverting due to people being seriously ill, life-threatening. The words Mayday really does open the skies for you, it's quite a fascinating process to watch, one I'd love to be a fly on the wall for. Wind shear, turbulence, general weather. I remember when I started the job I used to be so keen on what the weather was doing. Now we just turn up and brief it an hour before we fly. Severe weather? Tough, we're going. I've had turbulence so bad that even as a pilot I felt quite uncomfortable, dropping 100 feet in a split second, speed varying by 40 kts on final approach etc. Or when you cross a continent to find a forecast storm sitting over the runway and you've not got a huge amount of fuel left to make a decision. You can't press pause ever, every second you waste in these situations is fuel being burnt out the back of the engines. Other amusing ones, in Spain I once had to abort my landing and execute a missed approach due to a dog being on the runway. Passengers get a little unnerved by it, but it's all very normal to us. Took them a while to move the dog on, I hope they were nice to it. As I said, the industry is incredibly safe. We're not punished for mistakes, they are used as learning points. This encourages continued development from all parties and in turn it has turned the most unnatural thing for humans to do into an everyday occurrence. Small stuff happens all the time, but rarely is it a major safety concern. This extends to the mechanical side too. Planes are so well designed and manufactured these days that I have absolute confidence in my aircraft. People often ask me if I worry about flying, do I ever get scared? My simple answer is no. If I did, I'd be a bit rubbish at my job, considering I fly up to 20 times a week. In January 2007 I was on the passenger manifest for a flight from Mosul, Iraq, Camp Diamondback, to Tel Afar. The flight was scheduled to leave at 0100, I arrived just after midnight, and it was raining and pretty windy. About 15 minutes before the flight was supposed to leave we were told the flight was cancelled due to the weather. Since I was stationed at Diamondback I just went back to my bunk and hit the hay because I was told we would be flying out at 0600 instead. The passenger gathering point, Apex, was right next to the hospital and as I walked through the hospital on my way to the flight line a friend of mine came running up to me and threw her arms around my neck, hugged me, and started crying. It turns out the pilots changed their mind about flying and the UH-60 Blackhawks left at 0130. The helicopter had crashed just outside Tal Afar, was still missing at that point and my name was still on the manifest. We found out a few hours later that there were no survivors of the crash. It was a spooky feeling. I had to email my family and let them know if anyone showed up to notify them I had been Kia and that it was a mistake. I don't know if this belongs under this heading, but it's definitely the scariest flight-related event of my life. Not a pilot, and late to the game here, but on December 1, 1974, I was a passenger on a flight from Chicago to Washington National. The weather coming in was not good. Like other flights, we were probably routed to Dulles because National was closed due to weather. So was TWA 514 which slammed into a mountain ahead of us. That resulted in Dulles shutting down leaving us and presumably other flights circling over Washington. Circling for an exceptionally long time, fuel running low, we must have been the last flight cleared to land at Baltimore. We landed and the plane came to a stop at the end of the runway. The pilot came out and shook everyone's hands to applause. We deplaned right there at the end of the runway and were shuttled to the terminal. I can only guess that we landed without fuel and the plane had to be towed in. I was 5, and that's how I remember it. I was flying late at night. One of my planes is a small 6-seat propeller aircraft, A-36. I was flying a group of people from Nantucket to Cape Cod. About halfway at cruising altitude, several of the passengers wanted to do a 360-degree turn to get a pleasant view of the stars. Not only was it a cloudless night, but it was also a night of a new moon. So, there was zero light pollution. The stars were incredible and even the Milky Way galaxy was very visible. And being up at altitude, we had a 369-degree non-obstructed view. Even as a pilot, it was one of the most impressive views I've had. I reduced my power and started an exceptionally low bank slow turn. As I'm enjoying the view, the engine went from running nice and smooth to shaking the aircraft instantly. Immediately I knew something was wrong with one of the cylinders. After inspecting my engine instruments and playing with the power and mixture settings, I was able to determine that I still had detonation, but one of my valves was probably failing. My destination airport was the closest airport, as we were in the middle of Nantucket Sound. I continued there at a higher than normal power setting because it seemed like it was forcing the failed valve to still open with the extra power. I kept my altitude until I knew I could make the airport and then went idle and glided all the way in. Although I was glued to my instruments, none of the passengers expected anything or even noticed the sudden change of the engine mid-flight. Although the sound of the engine was questioned when we were on the ground, which I had explained everything. This unfortunately led to around $13,000 worth of engine work, but she's up and running now in tip-top shape.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.